Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. We have a shorter episode this week, just something I've been thinking about from the scriptures, something I kind of picked up at church services last week and thought I'd share with you. Basically, this episode centers around the pattern that I found in scripture of bread and wine. Anytime I see this pattern repeated, I just take note of it because there's something going on with these two things that I think is worth noting. And I haven't really quite synthesized it all together yet, but each time I see these things, it does put me in mind of the symbols of the Passover that Jesus institutes with his disciples before his crucifixion of bread and wine, symbolizing his body and his blood. And I see these in the Old Testament all the time paired together very specifically. And commentaries will say different things about them, but every time I see this in the scriptures, I try and look a little bit deeper and try to figure out exactly what the scriptures might be trying to communicate to me about the person of Jesus, because Jesus didn't choose these symbols for nothing. He chose them for a reason, and I think that reason is supposed to be found in the Old Testament each time these two symbols pop up in various stories. And I think in the story of David and Abigail, we get a very particularly interesting repeat of this echo of this type that's going on of bread and wine, later symbolizing Jesus's body and blood. Now, for those that don't know the story of Abigail, I'll just kind of briefly retell it because I don't want to, it's kind of a longer section. It's found in 1 Samuel 25, and I don't want to reiterate the whole thing. I mainly want to get to this portion that talks about these two symbols because I do think it's very telling. But basically, David is in the wilderness. He is not king yet. He's been anointed, but he's on the run from Saul. And so he's in the wilderness with his band of merry men, a little bit like Robin Hood, I think, which is kind of interesting. And he is at Mount Carmel, and he sees some people there who are taking care of sheep. So they're shepherds, and there are sheep shearers. And they are kind of tending to the sheep there, and David and his men, rather than plunder them like most people might have on the road, they decide to protect them. They keep watch over the shepherds as they're shearing the sheep. They share provisions with them. They care for them. They protect them from any evil that might befall them, like thieves or bandits, and they just make sure they're doing well. Then, as the sheep shearers leave to go back home and bring their sheep with them, David and his men send kind of an envoy to the master of these shepherds and says, hey, like, we've taken care of your people. A feast day is approaching. Might we join you as a gesture of goodwill for what we've done in protecting your people? And the man that they send this message to is named Nabal, and he is not a very good guy. He sends back a message to David saying, like, absolutely not. Like, what have I to do with you? You're not the rightful king. You are nothing to me. I don't care about your kindness you've done to my men. Get out of here. Stay away. David does not take very kindly to this. He doesn't like this response, and maybe his pride's a little bit hurt. I'm not sure if his response back to Nabal is a good and godly one or not. We're not often told the details of people's responses, whether or not they were a good response or a bad response. Often we're just told they responded in this way. But David is furious, and so he goes and he collects all of his men. He says, we are going to make this guy pay. We are going to let him know that what he just told us is not okay. We protected his people, we shared with them, we kept them safe, and now he's going to respond to us by treating us like vagabonds and just leaving us in the wilderness while a celebration and a holy time is coming upon us. Absolutely not. That is not a good response. It's interesting because David, when he interacts with Saul, he is so gentle. He doesn't want to attack Saul. He doesn't want to kill Saul. He recognizes that he is God's anointed. And so he's very careful about this. And almost we can get the idea that David doesn't see himself as king. And yet there are some ways in which David realizes that he has been anointed king and that he also is somehow the Lord's anointed at the same time that Saul is. And so disrespect to him is kind of disrespect towards God because he is the person God has chosen. Now, it's a little bit strange because we're not sure, like, how much of this is David responding out of ego and how much of this is David responding out of kind of like feeling as if God is maybe being slighted or just kind of laughed at by Nabal. We're not quite sure, but either way, this is David's response. He's going to gather his men, and he's going to go teach this guy a lesson. And as he's going on his way to go meet Nabal and kind of enact his vengeance on the man, Nabal's wife, Abigail, hears that this is going to happen. A servant who is out in the wilderness with David and who is protected by him goes to Abigail and says, listen, this is not going to go very well for us. David was a good guy. His people treated us well. Our master Nabal has responded poorly and treated him poorly. David's got a strong force. He's going to come and enact vengeance on him, and we're all going to end up paying for the mistakes of this guy. So Abigail does something really, really interesting that I'd like to point out, and this is in 1 Samuel 25, as I said before, and it starts in verse 18. It says, Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, Go on before me, behold, I'm coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. So here we have the 2 symbols we were talking about earlier, the grain and the wine, and there are other things added to them, but interestingly, all of them kind of fall into the categories of grain and wine anyways. Even the raisins, like the cakes of raisins, the Hebrew there just means pressed, things that are pressed, like olive oil, like wine, and we see those symbols being used very regularly, centering around the crucifixion as well. Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, where olives are pressed into olive oil, and he is feeling pressed and pressured by the ordeal he is about to undergo. Also wine, the grapes are pressed to make the juice come out of them so that wine can be made from the fermented grape juice. And so we have these other symbols alongside the grain and the wine, but they're also still very much related to the grain and the wine. They're almost like subheadings. And so Abigail comes to David laden with gifts on a donkey, and she is going to go take care of the situation that her husband Nabal kind of threw into disarray. And it says this, Now David had said, Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your servant. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. So she offers David a blessing here, and it's so interesting that she's bringing these gifts on behalf of Nabal. What I want to point out here is that it can be interesting that we see the symbols of bread and wine found throughout the rest of the Old Testament and finally adopted by Jesus at the Passover before his crucifixion. But interestingly, the entire story of Abigail really falls step by step in line with the story of Jesus Christ. This is known as typology, and I've talked about it before on the podcast, where just a person, an event, a story, a place, or a thing represents something to come. It's almost like pictorial prophecy. And I think this is so amazing, but specifically the typology that points to Christ is some of my all-time favorite. And here we have a beautiful type of a woman in the place or in the role that Jesus Christ would fulfill later as Messiah. Who else is it that comes before a king riding into the city on a donkey with gifts of reconciliation, of grain and wine, to take on the sin of an evil person before a king of righteousness? And say, place that sin on me and forgive the sin of the evil person. Who else does this besides Jesus Christ? Nobody. And Abigail here is the perfect picture of it. What's also interesting about this is that the setting of this whole story takes place at the time where sheep are being sheared in Israel. When does this happen? It always happens around the Passover, and we're nearing a great celebration, and she comes out and she offers David not only the grain and the wine, but also cakes of figs and raisins, which would have been unleavened foods as they prepare for the holy day to come. And so Jesus, entering into Jerusalem on a donkey, bearing the gifts of his body and his blood, the bread and the grain, as a reconciliation offering between God and man, as he goes into Jerusalem to take on the sins of mankind who have acted rashly and with lunacy towards the King of the universe, he is actually doing the thing that Abigail did in a smaller and lesser way on behalf of Nabal before King David. He is acting as intercessor, and Abigail here is acting as intercessor. And she does this years before Christ does, pointing to the ultimate fulfillment that he would offer up. And I just think that is such a beautiful thing, and hopefully you do too.